Okay, so open pedagogy. We'll talk a little bit about what that is and talk about some ways in which it can be applied and why you might be interested in doing it. So, so I guess the first question we should talk about is what is open pedagogy? Have you tried any open pedagogy projects? And what is it?
Um, I've been there a few years, so I haven't done too much for the open pedagogy yet, but it's something that I'm trying to work into my courses. Um, I'm kind of curious what kind of is the definition to what is
Okay.
considered open pedagogy, because I have an education background, and I don't always know like the newer terminology and what is considered like under that, but I know more like open-ended questions, those work well, and kind of giving more choices sometimes can work well. I'm actually not sure exactly what classifies as open
Okay.
pedagogy.
Open pedagogy, the concept pretty much grew out of the open educational resource movement, out of the OER framework. And it basically is an approach where you have students, in simplest form, students are creating rather than just consuming content, so that students are actively involved in the construction of knowledge and putting something together, which is often something that they share publicly. So it could be they create videos, it could be they create podcasts, it could be they engage in some sort of community projects that they then publicly share. Some recently, a lot of these things have been falling under the public good or the public good university type concept, where students are doing something that provides benefit beyond just their own learning. And it's often something that the students tend to be interested in or engaged in. And there's a lot of examples. We'll talk about some of them. I've been meaning to update a website I put together a couple years ago. It was updated last year, but so many of the links have gone broken, and I had hoped to do more with it, but it's been a busy week. But I will share the slides with you, and then if I will try to update that in the next week or so. But in any case, we can talk about some examples. Typically with open pedagogy projects, the students are creating work that's shared with others. Sometimes it's shared only within the class. Other times it's shared publicly in a public audience. And we'll talk about a lot of different ways in which that has been done and which it could be done. It involves active learning because students are actively involved in creating something. They're just not passively reading or listening to it, a lecture or listening to videos and so on. Um, and one of the things that open pedagogy offers is a phrase that was created by David Wiley from at the time he was with Lumen Learning. He's moved to other positions now. But the notion is that, students create a lot of work that they submit into their learning management systems. And then at the end of the term, it just disappears. Their courses close up. They no longer have access to it. And it was only created to be shared with an audience of just the instructor often. So with open pedagogy, they're sharing things with their peers at the very least, or they might be sharing it publicly. And when they share things for a public audience, they tend to take a little bit more pride in their work and they tend to want to display their best work in ways that they might not if they think it's just going to be an instructor giving them a grade at the end of the term and it doesn't go any further. Um, and we'll talk about some examples of that. Service learning projects often fit on into this category, where sometimes students build some sort of community park or something, or they work on some way of assisting a community group that's struggling in some way, using knowledge from their disciplines to work through that. Some examples. One of the first examples where this came up was Robin DeRosa from Plymouth State University, who just lost a job this year in a cutback, but she has long been a leader in the open pedagogy movement. Um, she was teaching a class, I believe it was in early American literature, and she was looking at the prices of textbook, and the textbook that had been used in the class was a Norton Anthology of Early American Literature. But what she noticed is that every single one of the articles in there, every one of the readings in there was available for free online. It was in the public domain. And students were paying 80 or $90 for the anthology. And basically what they were paying for was the fact that it was all collected as well as the annotations that were there. So what she decided to do, and this really helped kick off the open pedagogy movement or expand it quite a bit, is she had her students select sources. She worked with them in selecting the readings, and then the students created annotations and they put it together into an online textbook that then was open, released under a Creative Commons license so that other future classes could use it. And the hope was that other classes could even adopt it and then continue it further and add to it, add more readings to it, and add more annotations and put in more context. That rarely happened, though. What generally happened is every time she was doing a class, and my recollection at least, is whenever she had a new class, they wanted their own projects. They didn't want to just build on the project of others. But the idea of having students create something that they share publicly was something they really appreciated. And I've done this in my capstone course for about 5 or 6 years now. My students have created their own books. They've created, again, each time they want to do their own project, not building on something that earlier classes had done, or they created series of podcasts on topics related to economics. In a capstone course, it's a nice chance for them to pull together what they've learned and to take it a little bit further in some new directions. But so one example is just taking stuff out there and annotating it and then sharing it. And that can be done with all sorts of tools, like Hypothesis is a common one. Um, and that's one way to create a free textbook. And we'll talk about some other examples, but going back to that point, just one step further, one of our colleagues at SUNY Buffalo is teaching health science, and there were 3 books for the specific course she wanted to teach to use. Each one contained something that she thought was essential to the course, but it missed some of the other things. And she said the only way she could get each of those topics was if she adopted 3 books, and each of them was like $100, $250 a piece. So what she did is she brought the idea to the class of having them write their own textbook. It was a class of, I think, about 70 students, and she broke them up into groups, and each group was responsible for writing one chapter of this book. And each class day, they would address the chapter that their classmates had written. She provided some readings initially, but from then on, the students were basically creating the textbook as they went and getting feedback along the way from the peers and from her. And that was then released by SUNY as a textbook and so forth. And it's been used, I believe, since then. So that's one type of thing. Blogging is also something that's been used quite a bit. Reclaim Hosting has engaged in licenses with many institutions where the project was called A Domain of Your Own. It started, I think, at the University of Maryland, or that was one of the big ones, where each student was given their own domain, basically, and they had versions of WordPress and they could create blogs. So and the blogs could be used, for example, for student reflections on the learning process, or when classes were doing travel. If there was a travel class of some sort, they'd write blogs of what they were learning along the way. But a common thing was just having them reflect on their learning at each stage of the journey and publish that. And one of the nice things about any of these things is that students had something that was left behind when they left. It could serve as a portfolio of their work in some cases, or it was just an example they could post on LinkedIn or something similar, or they could share with their parents to say, look, I've learned something here. Or they could share it with their friends. And that's something that students have generally found really valuable. The fact that they're creating something that lasts, again, beyond just the end of the semester. And blogs was one of the most common ways of doing this, especially early on with this. Wiki pages is another. There's Wiki EDU, where you can work with people in this organization that works with Wikipedia, and basically students could pick a topic and build a wiki around that or develop a wiki on that. There was one interesting example of this about 4 or 5 years ago, I think now, was a class that was learning Portuguese in the US, decided that they were going to build a wiki on their communities or the cities or on the US that was written in Portuguese. So they were developing their language skills while filling in a Portuguese language wiki, which didn't have very much on their city or their communities or the state or the counties or whatever. And that was another way in which they could share some of their work. Um, Glossaries. We had someone here in the theater department a few years ago. She's moved on to another institution, unfortunately, but she had students create glossaries for some of Shakespeare's writings and so forth. Because a lot of the language is archaic, but her students went out, researched the origin of the terms, the background, the context, and so forth, and then created basically a website for a glossary. Podcast is another really popular one. Again, I mentioned I've had this done. I've done this, I think, about 4 or 5 times in my introductory economics course, and 3 times now, I believe, in my capstone course, where students have done it. And that's something that students often find interesting and fun because, again, it's something that they can share, and it's a little bit different than just writing another term paper. Vanderbilt University had a major project when Derek Bruff was there. He got the boot a couple of years ago and he moved on to some other things, but he had an incredibly rich professional development program at Vanderbilt. Most of the resources have disappeared, including all the podcasts or more recent versions of this. But they had something called Vandivox, where many classes created podcasts, and then each class voted on the best podcast, and then they shared that in a university-wide podcast, which was sort of the best of the podcast created by all these classes. And they were kind of interesting. Students, again, picked topics relevant to their disciplines and discussed it and presented on it. Video projects is another common one. One sort of project that many people have done is have students, say, in a college chemistry course, create videos for high school students learning chemistry so that they were basically taking what they've learned and putting in context so that students who are just beginning to learn this material could reasonably, so that they could assist students who were just getting started in this. Research. Now, this is a little bit tricky because a lot of research projects by students, when they're posted, end up becoming a source of other students copying and pasting. So a lot of those sites have been taken down because people were complaining. There was a site that had a lot of really good work done by students in econometrics classes that I used to share with my students, but I know they took it down ultimately because a lot of students were finding those papers and just copy and pasting and changing the names and so forth. But, when students are doing interesting research, sharing that publicly can be useful. Book projects is another. For a while, we had access on Well, for a while, anyone could use Pressbooks for nonprofit. Now there is a SUNY Pressbooks project, which you do have to get a special account for. But having students write their own book could be interesting. On 4 or 5 times, I've had students in the capstone class choose a book project where they pick a general theme, then they break up into groups for specific topics that they'd like to explore, and then they work together over the course of the semester to build that book, basically, where I had them do it in stages where they first write first as a whole class they put together an outline for the book, then they, in their individual chapters, they put together an overview of the chapter, and then an outline, and then they come up with a bibliography, modifying their outline as they explore the bibliography, then an annotated bibliography, then a rough draft of the literature review section, and then any research they're doing. And, it's done in stages and they're getting feedback along the way. And then again, they end up with a book where each one of them was responsible for typically a third or a quarter of a chapter in those books, in addition to other work they were doing, other projects they were doing in class. But it was it was a project that went from beginning to end, and they were really impressed by the fact that they had this thing that looked fairly professional that was published out there. And they're also learning a little bit about accessibility and things while they're doing this because, I insisted that they use proper header structures and that they use images correctly, and also talked about copyright and what sort of images they could use, things from the federal government or things they created using data and so forth was fine, as et cetera. And that was a nice learning process for them because, they were used to just copying and pasting a lot of things. So I enjoyed those much more than the research projects that I used to have them do with term papers. So some issues to consider. You know, Open pedagogy projects shouldn't be done just because they're fun, although they can be, for both students and faculty. But it should be something that's aligned with what you want students to learn in the class. And if they have fun along the way, that's kind of nice. But um, one issue that comes up often is that some students may not want to have the name on something that's publicly posted. If, for example, they've had issues with a stalker, or if they've been subject to online harassment or something similar, they may not want their name on that, or they may not want to have something posted publicly. There's a number of ways of addressing that. One thing you could always do is you could give them the option of doing an alternative project that's not publicly shared, or you could let them write under a pseudonym. Now, I haven't had that in my classes so far, but I could see it very easily happening. And, with some groups of students, that is, with in any particular class, you might have one or two students who have that concern, and you should plan for how you might address it and work with a student to come up with something where they're getting the same sort of learning objective satisfied. If they publish it under a pseudonym, that's kind of a fairly safe way of doing it if they choose to. But if they really don't want to publish something publicly, that's fine. One time I had students I was teaching a course, this was probably 15 years ago, but I was teaching a course in the history of economic thought, where they examined various, contributors to the development of economic theory and schools of thought and so forth. And each student was responsible individually for writing about three economists or three different schools of thought. I gave them a list of them. They picked from the list in the first third, the middle third, and the final third of the semester. And I had a student from Russia who wrote about Marx, but he took his stuff down at the end of the semester because he didn't think that when he went back to Russia at the time, that some of what he said might have been that well received. But that's the only time where I had a student decide to withdraw what they had contributed, on reflection after the class was over. You should come up with some way if you're going to have students work together, and there's a lot to be said for team-based learning, for them learning some teamwork skills and so forth. Those are part of the NACE competencies that employers are looking for. And it's useful for them to develop those skills, but come up with some way where students can collaborate. And that's going to be different depending on whether you're teaching face-to-face, whether you're teaching online or hybrid or high flex. I've done these projects both in face-to-face classes as well as fully asynchronous classes. But if students are going to collaborate in an entirely online class, it's a little bit more challenging. One of the things I've done is in forming groups, what I've had students do is use a discussion forum where if there's a specific focus for what we're working on, I give them a list of some broad topics they can work on. And I had them post on the discussion board what they were interested in working on, and also when they might be available to meet with another person. They were mostly working in pairs for that specific project. It was a podcast project. And basically, students can generally find a time where they can meet with a partner a few times over a few weeks, but those times are going to be different for each person because in an asynchronous class, you have some students who work only in the day, some people who work only at night, some people who are on shift work and so forth. And by, posting the times when they were available, they were able to do it. It all worked out, basically. There was one or two students out of 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years, where this was done, where they just didn't want to work with someone else, and I let them create their own, in those cases. But, I tried to get them to work together whenever possible, and 95% of the time that worked. Um, Another thing that's really helpful is, and if you're going to devise an open pedagogy project, come up with some way of making sure students are getting lots of feedback and revision on these projects. Um, and a good way of doing that is combining peer with instructor feedback, preferably letting the peers do some of the initial work on polishing this, and then you provide feedback along the way too, as well as, more final assessment at the end. But by using peer feedback, you can leverage the students' work, and they're learning by looking at what everyone else has done. In some cases, they'll learn that, oh, this may have been a better way of doing it than I had done. And other ways, other times they may make really good suggestions for other students. As long as you set it up in a way where, they're incentive, well, where you encourage them to provide positive, constructive feedback rather than just saying, I think this is great, which is a tendency many students tend to have in small groups or peer evaluation. Um, and but make a plan for that, because in general, students' initial work is often not as good as it will be if they have lots of opportunities for feedback. When I've had them working on either podcasts or on book chapters, well, with the books in particular, where they were working on all semester, at each stage of it, I had them work in Google Drive so they could all work together in each group in the same documents. There was one folder for each group, but it was part of a class folder that all students had access to. And when it got time for peer feedback, because they were working on these chapters as they were moving forward at different stages, I basically just took a PDF of it at the due date, so that way it was locked in at that date for each stage. And then I had them use Hypothesis to annotate each other's work. So each group was assigned two or three of the other groups to provide feedback on, and each member of those groups provided feedback to those two or three other groups within the class, and then rotated that around at each stage. So they all got involved in providing feedback on all the work that the other students had done, and each student got feedback from all of the other students. And that worked really well. And I provided my own feedback at each of those stages as well. But the student feedback was often really helpful, and often really positive. Well, it provided for some significant improvements. Again, students do need to be reminded about copyright and intellectual integrity, and that's a challenge. AI is also a bit of a challenge, but that's everywhere. And, if you do want this to be something that's going to last beyond the course, you want to think about ways in which this can be posted in a way that will be sustainable. And it depends on what you're doing. If students are creating videos, they could be posted on YouTube and they're just out there. It doesn't cost anybody anything. If you want to do websites, you could always use Google Sites or something similar, or one of the other free hosting services. For the podcast, for Pressbooks, we do have, if students do work on a book, there is the SUNY OER services has Pressbooks, where again, an instructor can get permission, and then you have to do the ultimate posting of the student work, but they create it all, and then you just basically copy and post it in and convert the heading structure from, the headers within Google Docs or whatever you're using to the headers within, Pressbooks, which is very much like WordPress. With podcasts, there are a few free services out there, but I've got so many of them out there. I do use a paid one for the classes, because I've used it for like 8 or 9 classes in total between my principles class and my upper level class, or my capstone course. But again, if it is going to be something other than a disposable assignment, it would be nice if student had access for it, at least for a reasonable period of time. So if you leave the institution, your accounts will ultimately go away. So putting things in Google might not always work. If I retire at some point, some of those things could disappear, but I did try to, I've set things up in such a way. So at least with a podcast, as long as I'm willing to keep paying a small amount each year, the server is still out there and they stay there. But there are lots of sites that will provide long-term free hosting, for limited amounts of material. Um, you do want to make sure, as with any other group projects, that you are able to evaluate the contribution of individual members. And the suggestion I got, I was first doing this with Google Drive by looking at the edit history, and that was just a tremendous amount of work trying to figure out how much was done by each person. But the colleague from Buffalo who had the class of 70 students write a book had a simple suggestion, and that was that each student in the group write with their own color. As long as there's enough color contrast, one person might choose a dark blue, one person might choose red, one person might choose a green, and so forth. And most of the groups were like 3 or 4 people anyway. So, but dark versions of the color that were not like close to being, the background color can work pretty easily. And it's pretty easy to track the color. And what I had them do is in their document, I just had them put their name and the color at the top, and I could just visually see what the contributions of each person was. And that worked. That worked pretty well. And there's other ways of doing it, but you could also use peer evaluations where they rate each other's contributions and so forth. But for my purposes, that worked pretty well. You also want to make sure we meet accessibility requirements because of Title II and all that. Okay, so those are some broad types, and we'll talk about some other examples in just a few minutes. One other thing that you should consider is how it's going to be licensed. Most projects like this tend to be released under a Creative Commons license, and the broadest one is Creative Commons by, which is basically attributions, which means anyone can use the work, and all they have to do is cite the original creators of it. So anyone can modify it, can remix it, do other things with it, add to it, modify it, as long as, again, they add to the history of this was originally created by this group and so on. That's the most generous one. And I've given students the choice of which sort of license they wanted on their books and things. And they so far have always gone with this. Another one is the CC BY, which has the same attribution, but also has share alike, which means that if anything that is shared, anything that other people use have to be shared under the same license. So for example, if you write a book and release it under a CC BY, a commercial vendor could use it and profit from that. But with a share alike, if you release it under that condition, the only people who could use it would also have to share it under a share alike condition. So adding those two SA letters to the Creative Commons license basically requires that it be licensed by anyone else under the same conditions. And we can add more letters to that, and you can combine them in different ways. Another one is to include ND, which is no derivatives, which means that anyone is free to use it commercially or non-commercially, but they cannot modify the work in any way. This is a really sort of common license for things like photographs or music or videos, where basically you're letting anyone use it with permission, but they can't alter it, so that they can't release it under, they can't change a storyline if you wrote a novel. They can't change the images. They can't use AI to modify the images. They can't redo, whatever it is, basically. You have to share it in the same way as it was original, the same format, basically. Um, and another restriction you could add is non-commercial, so that anyone can use it, but it can't be used to make profit. So other people are free to use it, combine it, mix it with other work, but it also has to be with attribution, and it can't be sold, basically. So it's designed to help encourage more sharing of OER materials. Okay. And of course, and you can combine them in any combination pretty much. They all have the BY attribution requirement, but basically you could mix and match. And again, my students have always just chosen the most generous one, and they didn't really have to worry about some commercial vendors coming in and picking up their book and making a movie of it or making profits from it. I don't think that was a major risk factor, and I think they pretty much recognize that. So yeah. And here, if you go to the site, it has more information on this, and it also has the images that you can use that indicate this with the appropriate image tags and so forth, which you can use as markup within the items themselves. And this was something actually where if you have students creating work and so forth, or if they're going to be in videos or in podcasts, in principle, you might want to ask them for a student release where they sign a form basically that gives you permission to share that publicly so that they can't come back and later say that they were kind of forced to do this or they didn't have your permissions. I've never used that, but it's often recommended, because in the classes where they've been creating this stuff in general, they talk about this all the way through. They work as a group and they're generally pretty enthused about sharing it publicly. But it's probably not a bad thing to cover yourself by getting things like that signed. And that, by the way, that link is to a Creative Commons license document. Um, any thoughts? Does any of this sound appealing or interesting?
Yeah, I was looking into creating a new lab for my historical geology class. I came upon one where the idea was like to create a hike, but I have like I'm going to take it totally different, but it just got my brain moving of where the students are supposed to know how to look at geologic maps, so they could use that as a baseline, and they're learning about the different eras and periods, and maybe finding areas that you could take like a road trip and what you would see along the way, and so they could potentially create some content associated with that. Um, the downside I see is that if I do it one year, then like, what do you do another year? If you're posting, especially if you're posting it publicly, right? Which I don't necessarily have a problem with posting things publicly, but how do I like keep coming up with ideas every year of new things for students to do that are still really relevant to the content and covering the concepts that they really should know? So, that's one thing I'm thinking about of, at least maybe making it uh, for them, potentially posting it online. And then the other, like I teach dinosaurs too, but there's over 100 students, and this is a bit trickier for bigger classes. So
Yeah.
uh, for my sedimentary stratigraphy students, trying to think about some of the things that they could potentially create in regards to that content. Currently, we do a semester, like a project towards the end where they're learning, uh, you know, the different skills that they need. And then we go out into the field. And the past 2 years, we've gone to this field site near Syracuse where they're going into a glen. There's not really a lot published, so they can't look up the answers. and and they look at the rocks, they measure, they use those skills that they developed during the semester, and then they have to write a report on it. And this is done, as they have a group work, but then they have to practice with writing geologic reports, basically.
Mhm.
But I'm trying to think of potentially other projects or activities they could do that, even if they aren't, semester long or big ones, even smaller format
Mhm.
ones that I could incorporate into the semester where they're doing something a little bit more fun, and maybe they learn the content a little better. Maybe they can pass that information along to others, and just try to think about new ways to present and also evaluate.
Yeah, and give them some idea, or let them give you some ideas. Might be another way of saying it. I'm thinking of doing this. Do you guys have any ideas what might be interesting applications, and let them brainstorm it a bit. Maps is something that people have done where they've created map layers. I mean, there was a freshman orientation class at SUNY Fredonia, actually, where the instructor had students go out and create a map for the next year's freshman students where it talked about their favorite places on campus or where they would go to various offices and meet the people there and talk about it and then write it up and embed that in a map layer, basically, that then could be shared in the future. Yeah, so, so map things could be interesting, but again, you
That
don't
actually
have
sounds like
to.
a neat exercise for the GIS class that we have.
Yeah, and in fact, it was a combination of some basic GIS with with that. They were just using smartphones to get the locations, but yeah.
Sure, sure. I mean, we do that sometimes in geology because, we'll actually check the smartphone location compared to our GPS and see how they compare.
So yeah, so it was, and I think a number of people have been doing that. I think there were some people here who were starting to do that, but I don't know if they continued. One of them left, so I'm not sure. But yeah, that could be interesting. There could be a lot of applications of that, potentially.
Hmm. Do
Okay,
you
well, go ahead.
have you seen many projects where they're just doing shorter videos and like smaller scale and then posting those?
Yes, there was a whole series of them at on economics, actually done by students at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. They took them all offline. They were wonderful. I used to use them. They were like 5 or 6 minute videos where there was a scenario illustrating this concept, and they were really well done and really amusing. And then they all disappeared. But that chemistry class where I don't remember where it was. It was on a podcast I heard it described where they
Mhm.
were creating videos that were shared with students, with high school students would be, an interesting project. And I think all those videos were fairly focused and short. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, I mean, yeah, if a video is too long, it can be a lot of work to
Right.
evaluate. What I used to do, going back 12 to 15 years ago, and I teach intro classes that back then were generally 350 to 420 students because 420 was the room capacity. Um, and I gave students the option of replacing their two lowest exam scores. They had weekly quizzes or exams, and I let them replace two of them by doing a video that embodied those concepts, either individually or as a group of 2 or 3 students. And I asked them to try to keep them short, but they didn't always. And I let them do it through the end of the semester, which was not an ideal thing. I had to stop it pretty much because it was just getting to be too much. Because with 400 students and maybe 150 videos being submitted in the last week of class, and many of them were like 10, 15, 20-minute videos, it was just unmanageable, basically. I was watching videos around the clock for a while there. But but yeah, creating videos, illustrating concepts, or even creating some websites. Let me just show you a few other things. Now, this is a website I created a few years ago with Judy Littlejohn. We did a presentation at OLC, and it was part of a SUNY task group too on open pedagogy. Um, and a lot of this stuff has kind of fallen out. Here were some blog examples. And I think these still work. These were some examples of blogs that were put together within classes. Um, I believe they're still there. Yeah. Um, yeah, there we go. Oh, come on. It's not letting me move on,
Click
but
save my
oh,
preference.
save my preferences. Okay. I, I I normally read it, but not when I'm presenting. I just
Yeah, I
get
understand.
okay. But so for each of these things, I have some examples and then some resources. So these are some examples of these, and the resources are were put together by people. I think this disappeared though. Yeah, that's why I just looked at these last night, and then I was planning to spend like 4 or 5 hours on this, and then I was reminded I had to review 9 people for an award through SUNY, and it just it was just too much, so I didn't get to it. But I'm hoping to get to it. Um, Here's a podcast with someone from SUNY Cortland, who uses blogs. With her classes, both at Cortland as well as before when she was at NYU. She does some interesting work with OER and open pedagogy. Here's a journal article on it. Um, Collections are another interesting example, and this is a really good one. The Fashion History Timeline at the Fashion Institute of Technology. This has been going on for about 6 or 7 years, I believe now. Each year, the classes pick some theme, one or two themes, and they develop information about it. So you can organize it by time period. You can organize, yeah. So from ancient world up to the 21st century. And then you can do it by different subcategories. Um, in the 15th century, they got it broken down by decade and so forth, which allows for lots of iterations on it over time.
Mhm.
And they have essays on it with artwork and year overview, thematic essays, film analysis. They have a dictionary of terms, and each year the classes in the some of their fashion classes add to this thing, and it's really well organized, and it's a really great example of this stuff, I think. Because if you click on it, it will tell you more information about it. So it has information on the details, descriptions, and so on. So this is kind of like one of the classic examples that everyone shows in terms of open pedagogy. It's kind of nice. The Baltimore Uprising in 2015 is an oral history of this and a video history of this. So they have archives of oral recordings, videos, photos, produced recordings, written accounts, and so forth. Which again is kind of neat. The Appalachian Oral History Project. This took place between 1965 and 1989, but they have transcribed all those oral interviews since then. So, collating information that's out there could be interesting in some cases. E-portfolios, there's not as many of those now, but that was a really big thing, and it's coming back a little bit. Glossaries, well, there was that example. Well, this was one from Literary Studies in Portland. Um, There's not so many research projects. Most of those have disappeared. The examples of this, here's some from some of my classes. There was also an Oswego veteran student podcast project, which was done by a collaboration between a writing class and a photography class and a graphic design class that was also working on websites. So they put together websites and they had students photograph some of the veterans they interviewed, and they recorded them and they put them together as podcasts as a joint class project. That was kind of an interesting project one year. Vandivox was, they still have some of the best ones out there, but the project just died when they basically killed off most of their teaching center. Um, Ways of remixing and annotating things. Great Works Annotation Project, again, is using, I believe it's a Hypothesis to annotate online resources. Um, and here, Fiona Call, who was at Oswego, talked about using Scholar. She moved to the University of Toronto. What happened actually is she had gone back to Canada during spring break, or she might have been on sabbatical leave in Canada, and when the pandemic hit, so
Mhm.
we lost her. But annotating the marginal syllabus, we did a podcast with someone who has worked with us quite a bit. Oh no, that was Bunny Stahoviak's. Service learning, there's lots of examples with this. One is just transcription. Now AI is doing a lot of this, but a lot of handwritten documents have been transcribed as class projects where, there were some slave diaries, there were some slave trades, there was all sorts of other things that people have been working in archiving and digitizing. And, some of the handwriting wasn't all that clear, but now AI tools are doing pretty well. But up until then, there have been a lot of those, and I think they still may use it. The Smithsonian has been using for many years student volunteers to do this, where they also research the history of the items and so forth. The National Archives has done this as well, and also here that Indiana University has been doing some crowdsourcing and transcription of historical documents. Um, Student created ancillaries, I think. Oh, okay. This is one where the videos create, that's where I wanted to have students find those student videos, but I haven't found them. I think they disappeared. But
Mhm.
here's Wiki Education, and here's a few other discussions of how students have been used in creating other things like wiki projects and so forth. Um, I have to update this. This is Robin Rose DeRosa's. Here's one of my class projects. Oh, and it was Jessica Kruger. I couldn't think of her name. That was a public health thing written by 75 students in her class. Um, and there's video projects. There's not too many of them. I did get rid of a lot. I've got to add some new ones. And oops, yeah. So I got to the point where I deleted many of the things that were broken, but
Yeah.
there's also various other things out there. Here's something that was put together again by people in the SUNY Open Pedagogy group. Um, and this is one more broadly. This was founded by Robin DeRosa and a psychologist who goes by the psych professor on social media. I don't remember his real name at the moment, but um, and here's more SUNY Open pedagogy projects and the SUNY OER thing. And if you want to add more, you can always submit it and it will, when we get around to it, we'll add them. But, you know, there's a lot of things out there. And this was a really fascinating project. I listened to a number of the student projects and I was impressed by them.
Hmm.
So So think about it, and if it doesn't have to be a big project, it could be a little one, but if students create something that they get to share, they find it valuable.
They're more likely to remember things too.
I know. Yeah, because writing term papers gets kind of tired after a while.
I know
But
it's kind of required in my historical class, so I'm trying to
yeah,
balance that a little.
yeah. A lot of historians have used unessays where they can do anything other than an essay for a project. Which
Well,
is
mine's a
again,
writing intensive course though,
yeah.
so they have to do something.
Yeah, although, digital storytelling could be writing if they script it out in advance, there's a little bit of flexibility there. But yes, they do
Oh yeah.
have to do some sort of writing, but writing can take many forms. It could be a script for a podcast. It could be, yeah.
Okay.
But if you do anything like this and you'd like to talk about it, we're happy to always schedule, workshops on this or during our, subsequent breakout series here.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I'll stop the recording.